Good morning, everyone. I see that we have already many people joining, but I'll probably wait 1 or 2 more minutes before starting with the introduction of this webinar. But welcome, everyone, in the meantime. Okay. So I think we can start. And good morning again, everyone. This is one of the CMCC webinars, and today we'll have the pleasure to hear about the Road to COP, a challenging alignment between climate policy and sustainable development, a research that has been conducted by Francesca Larosa, who is Marie Curie postdoctoral fellow at the Royal Institute of Technology in Stockholm. And just let me say, first of all, that this is a really interesting, critical, and timely analysis, which looks at the interaction and the relationship between NDCs and SDGs. And in a world that is increasingly facing climate threats, but at the same time, also in a world where we are projected to reach only 12% of the SDGs by 2030, looking and analyzing the alignment between climate goals and sustainable development is really, really crucial. So thank you, Francesca, for this research. Before we go into the details of, and we leave the floor to Francesca, let me just briefly mention to you a few facts about the Euro-Mediterranean Center on Climate Change, CMCC. We are a global scientific institution, which is focused on the study and modeling of climate change and its effects on society. And CMCC has been developing through the years foresight and quantitative analysis of our future planet and society. Currently, the CMCC is structured through, let's say, 3 research institutes. The first is the Institute for Earth System Predictions, which focuses mostly on climate science and climate modeling. Second is the Institute for Climate Resilience, which conducts research at the intersection between ecosystems, society, and climate, with the goal of enhancing the understanding of resilient development in the future. And then finally, the European Institute on Economics and Environment, which instead focuses on the economics of environment, energy, and natural resources with socioeconomic lenses and methods. Now, these 3 institutes are not meant to be, not conceived within CMCC in silos, but they actually collaborate across several cross-cutting themes. And they also collaborate thanks to the possibility to exploit an advanced technology, which is CMCC computing infrastructure. And I'll just give you a few numbers about the supercomputing center that we have at CMCC, which is the SCC. It has over 24,000 cores and 2,400 teraflops. And at the same time, it reaches 32 petabytes of storage capacity and over 40 petabytes of archiving capacity. So it is these numbers, let's say, just to give a perspective, it is the most powerful computational facility in Italy and among the most advanced in Europe. And in 2022, this SEC was moved to the CMCC headquarters in Lecce. And it's currently and progressively upgraded, both in terms of computing power and storage facilities. A few other facts about CMCC. So it is an institution which is present throughout Italy. There are, as you can see here, many offices. And it is somehow, you can think it as a network that connects public and private entities that work together on the issues that we care about. And finally, then he also mentioned that CMCC is also part of a core network of stakeholders and members, which and institutional partners, mostly, as you can see here, universities. We have University of Salento, of Ca' Foscari in Venice, University of Sassari, Tuscia, and Milan, and Bologna, but also the National Institute on Geographics and Volcanology, and also international centers like the Washington-based Resources for the Future. So now, after this, let's say, brief overview, let me just also share a few informations about this webinar. So you will not be able to write in the chat, but in order to ask questions and take part of the discussion, you can use the Q&A tool that you see on Zoom, or at the same time, you can also raise your hand and pose a question. Now, I'll leave the floor to Francesca. And thank you for listening to everyone.
Thank you. Thank you, Francesco. Let me share my screen. And thank you for this wonderful introduction. It's really a pleasure to have you as moderator. Now you should see my full mode screen, I guess.
Yeah, you can see you.
Okay, thank you very much for this introduction and for giving me the opportunity to present this work. As Francesco said, this work has been is focusing on the misalignment or the alignment between climate action and sustainable development goals. But in this paper, we're using artificial intelligence. And so I hope that you can also be stimulated somehow by the innovative method. It's a work that has been developed together with co-authors at the Royal Institute of Technology here in Stockholm, but also at the UPV, which is the Universidad Politécnica de Valencia in Spain. The motivation for this work is really to try to appreciate in a negative way, in a negative connotation, the most two important international agendas, which the Paris Agreement and the Sustainable Development Agenda 2030 are actually not on track to be met at the moment. Yesterday, this report on the left-hand side of the slide was published, which is the State of the Climate 2024. And this report is tracking 35 vital climate signals, 25 of which are currently a record high. So we're not really doing everything that we can to put ourselves on the right trajectory and transitioning somehow. But on an alternative note, only 17% of the Sustainable Development Goals, which are to be met by 2030, are currently on track, while 1/3 of them are stalled or even regressed. And it's clear that there are several factors for it, including COVID pandemics and the current wars that are happening worldwide, but still we're really not on track to meet both agendas. And we know from literature and also evidence that we need to promote progress on multiple goals precisely because when we do that, there are synergies that can be unlocked without losing momentum. So the two agendas, the SDGs, Sustainable Development, and the Climate International Agenda are somehow not just interconnected, but inseparable. And the design of this win-win solution can really be seen holistically only when we have a knowledge about the interlinkages happening in multiple contexts and multiple scale of implementation. And this is why it is so important to have this updated knowledge concept. There are studies that are looking at how to match these two international agendas. For example, here in Nature Sustainability published study in 2019 was actually looking at the synergies and trade-offs that climate actions were creating with respect to the Sustainable Development Goals. But the problem with studies like that is that mostly they are expert-driven, which means that you need quite some experts to come together, coming from a very wide, diverse range of disciplines, and they need to provide evidence by choosing what they think is actually promoting this evidence map. And in this study, which is very comprehensive, to be honest, 10 members came together without taking a systematic review, and one single item of relevant published evidence was deemed sufficient to prove that there was either a synergy or a trade-off, so a connection. However, studies like this are showing how important is alignment between international agendas and how important is, even more important is alignment between climate action, which is transforming our society, and Sustainable Development Goals. So the overarching goal of this paper is to reveal whether climate political documents, in this case, in our case, nationally determined contributions, are aligned to the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. And if these alignments is taking place, we also want to find out whether these interlinkages reinforce or hamper climate adaptation and mitigation efforts. So we aim somehow as objective of the paper, first to understand if the NDCs are explicitly or implicitly talking about climate, talking about other sustainable development goals. And whether there is this interlinkage happening, we want to understand what is the contribution of each SDG to hampering or reinforcing climate adaptation and mitigation. What we call here a positive reinforcement is a synergy, a negative hamper is somehow in our framework a trade-off. We don't use standard expert-based or elicitation process, but we tried to engage in an artificial intelligence deployed routine, which in our case uses large language models, so LLMs. And the idea behind it is to enable comparability. We know from previous studies that NDCs, nationally determined contributions, are very hard to compare because there is no standard format in which they should be actually presented and deployed. But we also want to work with LLMs in order to provide a framework that then can be replicated, reproduced, and also scaled up in case other documents arise. Plus, LLMs work with multiple languages, which avoid us the job of basically translating every document to English, which itself would introduce a strong bias in terms of our understanding. We advanced the state of the art in multiple ways. Currently, the literature is really looking at this connection between climate and the SDGs, but also connections across the SDG by either taking these expert elicitation processes or by looking at network models, so understanding how the network of these interactions are actually working. However, these methods really rely on time-consuming and very intense processes that are very hard to be replicated, but more importantly, they're very hard to be updated. There are also efforts in the scientific and practice community to create data tools, for data processing and analysis, for example, by doing what we do, analyzing a large amount of documents altogether. But these tools are normally relying very much on comparability between different documents using statistical methods, for example, similarity across methods, which is not wrong per se, but is missing one critical point, which I'm touching upon over the next couple of minutes. And finally, there are processes in build tools that can enhance policy making understanding, but again, they're very somehow dependent on the type of information that you include, and they're very hard to replicate in the first place. Why then are we using LLMs? So the reason why we think we're advancing so much the literature is because, and I'm going to give you a very short super crash course on why LLMs are so useful. When it comes to natural language processing, like rule-based systems, these systems are struggling very much with what we understand as humans when we speak about language. Let's take this very simple example. Peter saw Anna on the bench with a camera. The reason why context is so important is because this sentence itself can be interpreted in these 5 ways. So Peter can be the one holding the camera looking at Anna on the bench, or Peter can be the one on the bench looking at Anna that is sitting on the bench, or holding or not holding the camera. So the context in which a sentence takes place is very, very important. As community of people using natural language processing, we kind of found various methods, and the first one of which was to assign to every single word in the vocabulary a very specific vector. But imagine your vocabulary right now, you will have thousands, millions of vectors, so too many words. And also, we're not solving the problems because one word can take 2, 3 meanings at the same time. So we understood this community in natural language processing that is actually very important to place the word according to its meaning. So it doesn't matter what type of word we are using. What matters the most is the meaning. And the meaning is given by certain dimensions somehow. Take, for example, the examples of Duke, Duchess, uncle, and aunt. The 2 distances between Duke and Duchess and uncle and aunt are exactly the same, but they're placed on different dimensions. So whenever you're conceiving a word, the word doesn't matter anymore. What matters is the meaning that it captures. So somehow you understand that by assigning a meaning to a very specific question, you're already giving context So you're already using the context. But unfortunately, natural language processing are not very good at maintaining attention, which is basically the most important parameter where computers try to process text. As humans, we're losing attention very much, but computers really don't capture long-term dependencies, or at least they were not capturing long-term dependency before. From 2017, a seminal work called Attention is All You Need, published by a group of researchers at Google Research, transformed totally the landscape with an architecture that is called, for a reason, transformers. So somehow this architecture is capable of analyzing huge portion of text. So we're talking about a long-term attention, and to build context-aware word meaning. That's why the computer is now able, thanks to transformer architecture, to understand the meaning between the cat drank the milk because he was hungry, where it refers to the cat, versus the cat drank the milk because it was sweet, where it refers to the milk. Because every word is related to every other word, maintaining attention very high. End of this crash course, because LLMs in this case are the most suitable tools precisely because context in which the nationally determined contributions are developed matters very much. So what we do in this paper is to manually download a nationally determined contribution from the UNFCCC. We treat the text in such a way we can retrieve meaningful self-contained unit of text, which in our case are paragraphs. And then we developed two prompting routines. The first prompt tries to understand if every paragraph is talking about none, one or more SDGs in an implicit or explicit ways, precisely because transformers are able to understand the long-term context with the knowledge they embed. The second prompt that we launch instead is trying to ask the machine to determine if this connection with the SDGs is actually reinforcing or hampering climate mitigation and adaptation. Therefore, we create a matrix somehow of synergies, positive, and trade-offs, negative, interactions across climate and SDGs. Our database covers more than 80% of emissions worldwide, which is, again, very much in line with what previous research was doing, but in our case, it can be replicated anytime, somehow launching the routine that has been developed now. Let me just anticipate whatever potential concern. We're not claiming in this paper at all that experts should not be consulting. Actually, the great majority of the work that we have been doing on this paper is really to interpret and understand what were the funding coming from the LLM, and you shouldn't trust the LLMs at all without having expert knowledge, because LLMs can, of course, be very much inaccurate in multiple things. In terms of historical greenhouse gas emissions, as I said, we're covering more than 80% worldwide, and we're covering a time frame that goes from 2015 to 2023. We're having very short NDCs, and we're having pretty long NDCs. The shortest is San Marino, the longest is El Salvador, but more or less the reason why LLMs are also helping is that the format of these LLMs are absolutely different, meaning that some national determined contributions are including, for example, figures, some national determined contributions are including tables, some national determined contributions are instead very short and very concise. As I said, we don't deal with the whole document because there wouldn't be any point in assigning to one document multiple SDGs. Better, you would find for every NDCs, all SDGs totally covered. So we split the document automatically by engaging in a sentence segmentation algorithm. This is important because we are not the one deciding what a paragraph looks like, but we're asking the machine to extract paragraphs either when it finds full stops or meaningful structures. And we derive this sentence segmentation in a way that we can have more or less an average paragraph of 65 words. So it would be more or less 5 lines in a Word document. And this is the unit that we analyze. So for every paragraph, we then launch the prompts that I explained before. Let's go straight to the results, which are at the very end are the most interesting part. So the result one is actually looking at the actual frequency of mention of the SDGs. We're using this distinction developed by the Stockholm Resilience Center, the so-called SDG wedding cake, to understand if countries were engaging more into environmental topics, into societal topics, or into economic topics. You can see that there is already quite a visual understanding that countries are very much somehow polarized. So content that is related to the environment, which in this case is protection of our biodiversity, protection of our life below water, SDG 6, which is actually water infrastructure and climate, is very much the concern for most of the so-called Western world and some of the emerging economies, while societal issues, which have way more to do with transition, transforming our agricultural sector, but also transforming our health system, transforming our infrastructure, are very much the focus on the southern part of the world right now. In the second result, we're actually looking at the strong connections. So what I mean by strong connections, I mean the average SDG connections for all the paragraphs, irrespective of the type of country that we are analyzing. And we find a very strong connection in that we called the climate energy infrastructure, so SDG 13, SDG 7, SDG 9, where countries are really reinforcing this idea that to put forward climate action, you need to have a good infrastructure system in place, also to deploy the so-called low carbon energy technologies. So if you don't have the grid in place, for example, you cannot think about transitioning anywhere from the standard, somehow the standard energy solutions. We also find for lower income country a very strong nexus between SDG 13, SDG 6, so water resources, and SDG 2, which is agricultural sector, which already gives us an idea of where countries are going in terms of their development trajectories. There are countries that still need somehow to reinforce their traditional economic sectors. And then we computed the actual strength of the individual connections. You see that in this big heat map, colorful heat map, they are not somehow, the matrix is not perfect. In fact, every connection, every SDG measures the strength of the other's connection in relative terms. So for example, and you must read this picture from the y-axis to the x-axis. So you read it from the relevant SDG towards its connected ones. You can already appreciate that no poverty, SDG 1, is, for example, very much connected to SDG 8, which is economic opportunities. And it doesn't come necessarily as high surprise. I mean, if you want to go out poverty lines, for example, you must develop and put in place decent work and economic incentives as such that those poor portions of the population can come out of these poverty traps. We also find that there is quite a strong link between SDG 10, which is inequality, and SDG 8 again. So countries appreciate the sum of the policies that you need to put into account when it comes to climate action must consider climate action in a way that is equal, but that also needs to promote decent work opportunities and economic opportunities for everyone. And we also find some connections between, for example, SDG 1 and SDG 11, which gives you an idea that urban communities and sustainable communities might also be such if there is no poverty raise that is actually pending on the shoulders of the people involved. Then we move at how countries are talking in terms of sentiment. What we mean by sentiment is, again, the synergy level or the trade-off level. So if these paragraphs are actually talking about something positive for climate adaptation and mitigation or something negative for climate adaptation and mitigation. And here we measure the length of the paragraphs that we need, and you can appreciate already that the negative paragraphs, so the ones that are actually explaining some things that doesn't represent a synergy for climate adaptation and mitigation, but instead it trade-offs that country need to take into account, require longer paragraph. Why? Because country need to frame it very much. And this is, again, something that itself in the computational linguistic world is very important, but also in terms of policy making is very important, because those are the paragraphs where potentially you need to pay way more attention in terms of reading when it comes to actual reading of the NDCs. We measure also the negative to positive ratio of the countries. You can already appreciate that some countries are very negative, meaning there are more negative than others when it comes to explaining how they're supporting climate adaptation and mitigation. So the darker the color in the top figure, in the top map, the most negative you are. And countries are very much measured in terms of negative sense when it comes to comparing the negativity with one across the other, so the Z score. And you can see that those countries that are actually very negative are also way more negative than others in presenting their fundings. But let's move to, I don't know, the good news. So the ones we called with the terms synergies. So we see that low-income countries and high-income countries, which is the split that we make to actually frame our results, where the income classes are designed by the World Bank, so they're not somehow superimposed by us. Low-income countries and high-income countries are very much converging to some of the synergies. So some of the linkages across SDGs, which are also reinforcing climate adaptation and mitigation. But I want you to focus on very specific pairs. So low-income countries, which are the light blue ones, are focusing very much on synergies that can come out in traditional sectors like water, but also food security. And they are focusing for multiple crises, such as, for example, the biodiversity one. So how are we going to protect biodiversity while also reinforcing climate actions? They are the ones calling for stronger cooperation in the first place. So I'm talking about SDG 17 right now, but I'm also talking about them reinforcing the need to have way more infrastructure in place, because otherwise you could not reinforce SDG 6, water, but also SDG 2, so the agricultural sectors. And they're also very strong in calling for these needs, again, to put together agriculture and climate action, where agriculture is both a contributor to mitigation and adaptation. They're calling for stronger economic opportunities, and they're also calling for biodiversity protection when it comes to developing a new energy system. There are also calls for, again, stronger infrastructures in terms of disaster risk reduction, which low-income countries are really pushing from, but they're also stronger in terms of changing standard production and consumption modes, as well as creating new decent work opportunities in, again, traditional sectors. If you're looking instead to high-income countries, you see a strong, pretty strong focus in developing this energy transition with infrastructure happening, and they're reinforcing in multiple ways, especially when it comes to urban communities. High-income countries are very much concerned with urbanization and how sustainable communities will be in the future. But also, and finally, we're changing really our waste recollection modes, and so our standard production and consumption systems. And finally, in protecting biodiversity, again, when it comes to some of the pressing low energy transition challenges. Let's move to the trade-offs instead, and we compare again between low income and high income. So here is the somehow SDG pairs, which are not supporting in trivial way climate adaptation and mitigation. So lower income countries discuss their trade-offs with stronger emphasis again. And they do so, especially when it comes to disaster risk reduction, SDG 11, and they're paying a lot of attention to transportation sectors, we notice, especially in sub-Saharan Africa. They mentioned that there are water critical infrastructure that must be protected by climate impacts, and they're very much under threats. There are also some luxury concerns. That's some sort of issues that only high-income countries in some form or another are covering extensively. The need, for example, to change the educational skills that we need to put in place the low carbon transition, which are not very much into place. Some high-income countries mention the lack of physical climate risk models within their own routines, and they're asking for stronger cooperation in that. We zoom in regional trade-offs. So we try to focus on the trade-offs by looking at what are the countries that are actually putting forward these trade-offs in a more concerning ways. On the left-hand side of this picture, you have societal SDGs. And on the right-hand side of this picture, you have economic SDGs. And you can see, and here we represent the entire world, by the way, but the strongest countries talking about the trade-offs are typically in the so-called global south. And I'd like us to focus on the first societal trade-offs maps, SDG 16, look at the effects of war and conflicts when it comes really to put together climate adaptation and mitigation. Those countries which here are highlighted in blue. These are the countries that are putting forward within their NDCs the need for peaceful institutions in order to have a climate action which is actually grounded and somehow which is reinforcing the concept of putting forward, again, both the Sustainable Development Agenda and the climate agenda. On the economic terms, instead, countries are very much connected with the idea of having decent work opportunities, which must come together hand in hand with transformed production and consumption mode, but also come together with equitable processes. And finally, they're very much concerned, at least China in this case, with forming those partnerships that can enable a global and coordinated climate actions. In the paper, we derive 3 major policy implications out of the ones that I showed you at the very beginning, which are the innovative methods behind this paper. The first one relates to climate and development assistance finance. So when you have these synergies clear and in place, you can also have a somehow more refined financial flows disbursement. So countries are somehow calling for this assistance and the financial flows to come in. They're calling for technical transfer. They're asking technical transfers to be in place. But whenever we want to be formally stronger somehow to align these 2 international agendas, to unlock these synergic opportunities, these analyses must come very much handy. The second policy implication is that some of the things that we find here are actually describing different development trajectories. And what you don't want as international community is that we put forward somehow an adaptation and mitigation plans, a climate action, creating the same uneven picture that puts some countries in locked-in effects. And that's why having these analyses in terms of synergies and trade-offs can really spot where climate and SDG risks come together. Finally, we find that there is a really low coverage in terms of education, SDG 4, and gender dynamic. And these should be way more relevant in the NDCs somehow, because you want to build the skills of the future, but you also want to build the models of the future. They're accounting for the for the most vulnerable groups, and they account for an holistic perspective way more. I'm very much thankful for the opportunity to present this work, and I look forward to your questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Francesca, for this super nice presentation and really exciting work. We indeed have already some questions and comments, so I'll be sharing them out loud. First, we have Joseph Badevokila that says, first of all, thank you for offering this interesting webinar and is sharing with us his experience. He just delivered a consultancy work on updating a GCF country program for Guinea. And one of the recommendations was to engage the country to embed the SDGs in the climate projects portfolio. So this country actually resulted in being very happy to follow this recommendation. And in this regard, he comments that your work would be a valuable way to measure and monitor the SDG achievement. aligned with the NDCs. So both for measuring the progress and the correlative impacts and beyond. So this really gives an idea of the practical implication of your works, I think. So that's great.
Yeah. Yeah, I think it's super important to have this perspective, especially because it gives you the idea that countries are also looking forward to develop this trajectory, and they need a system to do so. So yes, thank you for sharing that.
That's great. And then we have a question from Amin Hazanein that says, how much would your result differ essentially to, given that you're using an LLM-based approach, from the findings of the trade-offs and synergies of the last IPCC report that was published last year on SDGs?
We agree somehow with so if we focus, for example, on the synergy perspective right now, we somehow agree on, we confirm somehow this funding. So we were very relieved to actually compare some of this funding with the published literature. We find some difference in terms of strength. So if you do analyze the language, you care about the context, of course, but you also care about the way countries are expressing their concern. Our sentiment, so synergies and trade-offs, is expressed on a scale, on a 0, 1, 2 scale. So if it becomes a trade-off, so a negative thing, when it's marked as 0, it's neutral if it's marked as 1, and it's a synergy if it's marked at 2. And we actually find that developing and lower income countries or emerging economies are way stronger in pushing for both synergies and trade-offs. So somehow they are pioneering even this work. So we think we complement very well the IPCC work, with the exception that the IPCC is a 7-year process. And this is not. So we think that somehow by including these methods in a routine, we could have a nice integration that can then reinforce the super valuable IPCC report.
That's great. Thanks, Francesca, for your answer. And while we gather other questions, maybe I can also pose a little question and comment about this work. So it's an AI-powered analysis, right, that provides also policymakers, not just the scientist community, with these insights. And this insight, and looking at the perspective of policymakers, these tools can help them navigate the complex interlinkages, right, between climate action and sustainable development. So my question to you would be, what do you think are the limitations? So looking at the other angle of AI in this regard, like in them being a tool for policymakers, and are there any risks in relying too much on this type of automated analysis for policy decisions, especially when they are addressing, right, very complex issues?
Yes, there are. To be honest, there are many. So in this paper, we are a group of 7 authors, 2 of which are very much coming from the climate and sustainability world, and 3 of which are coming more from the AI community. And I think that the synergy between us is really what makes the difference, because some of the very sophisticated modeling part that the AI community is bringing forward alone doesn't really appreciate the nuances, for example. So yes, there are many decisions that you need to make, for example, when programming a machine or when designing the prompt. So the prompt is very important. Just to give you a flavor, we ended up with 2 prompts, so a 2-stage prompt structure. But for every prompt, we tried 10 different combinations. So we actually then evaluated manually paragraph by paragraph, or we compared the results with published literature to see if the results were okay or were not okay. I think that these are tools. And so being tools, they're inherently supporting something else. They shouldn't ever become the end or the absolute crystal clear truth. So the good point would be to have these tools in place by showing results to a community that is actually 120% engaged in the climate negotiations, in the NDC process, and in everything that really has to do with more the climate diplomacy point of view. So there are many risks also in terms of biases, which we shared in a separate paper that we submitted recently. I think that LLMs are way better now at handling biases in terms of language representation, and the fact that they can read multiple languages at once, avoid countries with the difficult position to really have to translate what they mean and what they want to translate into a foreign language, like the benchmark language, English. But yeah, you should treat these tools with a grain of salt always. And the best thing would be to work with a community that is really already engaged, have been engaged for years in the climate diplomacy arena.
Thank you. Thank you for your answer. And definitely agreed. We have other questions from Dirk Hoffman, who's asking first, how far can you equally talk about adaptation and mitigation in its relationship with NDCs? And the second question would be, what would be the result if you took as a basis of analysis the voluntary national reviews of the SDG implementation? So kind of looking at the different documents, like of, I guess also in terms of the SDGs implementation.
So how would the results change? Genuine answer, I don't know. Honestly, I don't know. While can you speak at the same time about climate adaptation and mitigation? So we were not in the position of talking about climate adaptation and mitigation before. But since 2021, if I'm not wrong, the NDCs contain a climate adaptation part. So before, they used to be just what countries aimed and planned to do in terms of greenhouse gas reduction. Well, now countries and NDCs have a climate adaptation component. I think it's very important to differentiate between the two. And honestly, it is my strong desire potentially to have a separate work where we're looking at climate adaptation and mitigation separately. So you can have a prompt that is actually asking for climate adaptation and the prompt that is asking for climate mitigation. But in this case, the idea was really to put forward the focus on sentiment. So the synergies or the trade-off, because that is the most difficult thing to find. It's possible in many studies, you will find NDCs linked to SDGs, so classified according to several SDGs. But many more studies, very few studies are actually looking at what is the relevance of these connections in terms of, synergies creation or trade-offs. And the prompt itself is the most challenging because you need to explain somehow to convey to the machine what is a synergy and what is a trade-offs. And to do so, we give the prompt instructions based on the literature. So we tell the prompt, please learn that a synergy means something that is reinforcing something else. And we give examples to that. But I totally agree that if you have two separate foci, so you look at adaptation on one hand and mitigation on the others, you could have even a more rich or a richer analysis, yes.
Scope for another paper then.
Yeah.
We have also a question from Carla Schulte that asks, actually it relates probably to the discussion we were having before, really going on the point of bringing these findings and these methods to the attention of politicians and other decision makers. So if you feel you have other, maybe you can talk about the engagement of your Marie Curie or your take on this would be great.
Yeah. I think, these tools are like a very good book on a shelf. You buy it, you know it, like many that I have here. You buy, you know that you have it, but if you don't read it, it just looks cool on Zoom. So in the end, it's very important for us as a research community to publish this thing because we want it out, of course, and not for ourselves, but because you can have it out and you can cite it and you can show it and you can present it. But for a policymaker, the important thing is to see this connection happening and then to be able to read the paragraph this connection is referring to. So an actual tool may be even more interesting for a policymaker to have. And that's what we're working on right now, not in terms of visualization, but the ability to actually read what is the paragraph that the machine is assigning to these sort of connection. For two reasons. First, you want to agree or disagree with the machine. So you have a sort of validation process happening. And second, because you do want to appreciate if the machine is capturing something that with your knowledge you wouldn't be able to somehow. So it's giving you a novel perspective you can build on somehow. I think, you know, it's our strong desire to publish these things, not necessarily, again, to have it out, but more importantly, to have these things at their conferences or at international gatherings. And that's why I think this webinar is actually way more important than other places or other avenues. Within two projects that we have, so I hold Marie Curie, but also one of my co-authors, my professor here, is an holder of an ERC grant, which makes way easier for us to disseminate the results somehow. But it's always very important to have this knowledge that these tools are out there, they exist. And apart from us, there are also many other people that are working on them. And then it's on policymakers' side to understand if they're interested somehow to look inside these tools, or if instead they prefer really to have a roundtable discussion only, where several experts are coming together. I think the two things can go together very well. They can be integrated.
Perfect, thank you. We have another few questions, so let me just jump straight to them. Alessandra Drigo asks if the method you use or your interpretation of the results can say something more about the negative or very, let's say, polarized sentiment analysis, especially, for instance, for countries like Kazakhstan, so where you have these really clear results on very positive or negative.
Yeah, so let me say that one big portion of the paper is actually developing the entire narrative around clear examples. So we're not just writing, we found trade-offs here, but we're actually making examples of what the trade-offs are. And in the case of, for example, Kazakhstan, in the case of countries which are very much fossil fuel attached in some form or another, the negative things come really from this idea of the transition. So this idea that yes, transitioning is good, but either you need more pledges, more money committed, or you need more technological transfer. The negativity mostly come from the idea that the transition can be non-coordinated enough, or it can be too costly for countries that are already quite supported by, for example, fossil fuels, or it can be disordered. For some of the most negative countries, I have here a list, for example, Azerbaijan, Vietnam, Senegal, Kuwait. This transition is very expensive because they don't really see coordinating action coming together in their NDCs. And of course, they're not naming and shaming. They're just saying that they need more technological transfer, more coordinating action. They need more coherence. They need more consistency. So sometimes they're putting forward the idea that, yes, we would be willing to transition, but not alone and not as pioneers. So they actually put forward these trade-offs way more. I think that the most important trade-offs are actually coming in terms of SDG 16. So when it comes to institutions, we clearly see Cuban, Venezuela are two NDCs where they're putting forward really that they have retaliations. And so thanks to the retaliations, they cannot really put forward a plan which is consistent with a coherent climate action. And so they're calling for a war in peace in order to have all their carrots on the deck somehow. But yeah, typically the trade-offs is the actual part in the paper where we're talking more about why countries are detailing these wrong sides, and this majority of these wrong sides have really to do with the lack of coordination, lack of consistency, and lack of a peaceful institution, serene institution landscape where their policy are credible enough. Trade-offs, we call it trade-offs, but the best term would probably be negative sentiment, because the prompt asks in what way is the paragraph talking about something that can hamper, halt, or diminish climate adaptation and mitigation effort. So it's somehow talking about something that is posing a risk to the success of climate adaptation and mitigation.
Thank you, Francesca. And a quick follow-up on this, because you mentioned that you use many examples to contextualize your results. And I was curious to know if you actually select on your own, like you researchers have selected the best matches, or if also something that's powered by AI, the selection of this.
So we have a score in terms of negativity, which is the score that I showed before on the map. So how negative are you? And we look at the most negative to begin with. Then inside the most negative, we select the most representative examples. But so, you know, if the paper is published in the supplementary, there is the full list of paragraphs with the scores and the assigned SDGs as supplementary material, which by the way, can be a very useful labeled data set for somebody else that is performing this analysis. But the way we choose is not necessarily the most representative for us. And by us, I mean me and the colleague that are coming from climate and sustainability domain, but is the top scored in terms of negativity when it comes to the machine, yes.
Okay, so it's AI selected in a way,
yeah.
but in terms of its score. Okay, thank you. We have other questions. First, there's a question by Maria Clara Heyerabay that asks if you believe that this approach can also be used to assess private sectors' alignment and progress on climate.
Yes, very much. And I'm going to share, let me share a second, the one slide, because I think it really responds to your question, if I find it, because it's... okay, I think I'm almost there. Yeah, so in the slide where I tried to convey what the literature was somehow doing, which is this one. So you will see that when it comes to creation of tools, data processing and analysis, one example of this private sector, two examples of this private sector oriented analysis are under creation of tools for data processing analysis, SDG Monitor and Chat Report. So SDG Monitor is taking private sector documents and is somehow addressing every private sector document to a relevant SDG. So imagine the sustainability framework of a company. That company wants to know in which way is contributing to what SDGs. This SDG Monitor does that. It tells you, taking the text, which SDGs are the most related to that text, but it's not giving you any type, any synergies or trade-off, any positive or negative. It's just assigning you to SDGs you're contributing to. Chat Report is doing the same thing to find greenwashing instead. So it's basically looking at reports and is trying to measure in what way private company are talking about climate or they're not. And if they're talking about climate, in what way are they talking about climate? In negative, neutral, and positive way. In fact, our sentiment scale, so negative, neutral, and positive, come exactly from Chat Report. So yes, private sector, but I would suggest that these tools can be applied to municipalities that normally have a lot of documents they produce, and they want to make sense of them. They can apply to even a university, a funding institution, a research office. Every place where you're producing textual material could potentially use these tools, yes.
Thank you. I'll go forward because we have another few questions and not many minutes left. So from Adria Mihaya Ranavozon, we have a question, actually two questions. One related to the fact that you mentioned that you use the number of words to define the concern of a country about SDGs, and is asking if it's actually related to the if you could also look at the importance of the country regarding one topic or theme. So the strength of the word rather than the number, if that could be an indication, essentially. But perhaps you also use the strength of the wording. So a clarification somehow now the algorithm selects the salience of the negative or positive connection. And the second question, always related to the method somehow, is if you have a sort of sensitivity with respect to different AI models or prompts with respect to the results.
So If you're looking at this slide, for example, so I believe that you're not, well, here you are. Here we're not looking at the amount of words mentioned per SDG and we simply add up. So what the LLMs does is not to actually focus on the simple word, like here, but what the LLM does is to understand the context in which each word is happening and to focus on the meaning behind that context. So let me make an example. If in previous natural language processing methods, for example, one word could be low-income countries are stronger in their narratives about climate change. So what you used to do was counting the times that the name poverty or income was appearing in order to assign that sentence to SDG 1, no poverty. In this case, you don't do that. You don't need anymore somehow to count the exact keywords that are referring to a specific topic. But what you need to understand is the context in which this sentence is happening. So this context, this sentence is not mentioning the word poverty at all. It could say emerging economy or vulnerable economies are somehow going strongly with the narratives around the climate change. The LLM will assign this sentence to SDG 1 anyway and to SDG 13, because it understands that what we're talking about is countries which are typically more vulnerable in terms of income. So you don't need to count the words anymore. But what you validate, though, is the context in which the word that is somehow belonging to the idea of poverty is taking place, which comes back to the second question that this colleague asked. Did you validate? Yes, you have to. Because it can be that the LLM takes for vulnerable countries only in terms of climate vulnerability and doesn't talk about poverty. So you have to look inside what the results are and to decide if the results are good or not. You have two ways. Either you do it manually or you compare the results against something, a benchmark somehow. And we did the two things. We looked inside the results manually and we compared the results with the previous literature somehow. But yes, you cannot trust these LLMs. You cannot trust any machine to begin with, I believe. So it's important to cross-check. But in this case, you're not simply counting the words. You're taking the words as relevant in terms of what they mean within the context. I hope I explained, but I'm very happy. Yeah, I'm very happy to elaborate offline in case.
Thank you, Francesca. And we have a few other questions that we close the discussion. The first comes from Marcella Bertacchi that asks if this tool and the use of this tool for governance can be somehow developed according to the principle of do not harm. So the do not significant harm principle of EU regulation. Above all, objective 6 of climate resilience of this regulation. And then second question would be if the concept of mitigation is linked to climate neutrality instead of the resilience concept. So if you agree that the concept of mitigation is linked to climate neutrality instead of the resilience linked to adaptation. So if you can elaborate on these two.
So yeah, potentially you can tailor somehow this tool according to another principle, whatever other principle. The challenge here is that you really need to agree on that principle and to somehow transfer what that principle means in your prompt. So we know the LLMs, large language model, in this case, we use Gemini, but we also cross-check with OpenAI, and we cross-check with an open model called Llama 3. We know that these large language models have this knowledge within their premises. So if you ask the machine, what is the do not harm principle? And we could do it right now with, I don't know, ChatGPT, for example. ChatGPT, in theory, has this knowledge embedded already. But you don't want to leave the model to go without control. So we want to limit its ability to use previous knowledge, because we tested it. And when you let the model free to go without any limitation, the model invents the so-called hallucination principle. So you want to block the model, give a perimeter to the model. So you could definitely tailor this machine according to the do not harm principle, but you need to translate what the do not harm principle is and entails within the prompt, and so giving it in the instruction. While for climate mitigation, I'm sorry, I think I don't fully recall the question, but for climate mitigation, we also gave instructions. So we took the definition of climate mitigation from the IPCC, and we asked the machine to stick to what climate mitigation means according to the IPCC definition that we gave, rather than letting the machine free to go without any boundary. And again, as everything, boundaries are very important. And if you don't put any boundary, you are at risk of losing a lot of control in terms of interpretation of these results.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Francesca. Let me just also finally close by saying that many people have been interested to the project links, results. So I think you'd be happy to share this with the audience, and also remind the audience that this seminar was recorded, so you'll have the opportunity to have the recordings very soon.
Thank you. Yes, definitely. I think that, my email was displayed, but in the recording, when it comes out, you can definitely take note of that. If you're interested, there is going to be a website up and running in very few weeks from now, because as I said, our plan is to develop a tool out of this, so the policymakers can really, again, click and see what are the paragraphs that are mentioned to this link. So I will be very happy to contact the people that showed interested, and then send you out the links. Otherwise, I guess stay tuned on these screens, and you will see it anyway.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Francesca.
Thank you.
It was very, very, very interesting.
Thank you. Thank you for attending and for your optimal moderation. That's it.
Thank you. And I wish a nice day to everyone that attended. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye-bye.